Hey everyone, it's me, Mr. Cox. So I hope that you had a great spring break and I hope that everything's going well. I haven't done much for spring break. I bought a bow and arrow to try to get better at archery. It's actually pretty difficult. Uh, so today we're going to do one of the PowerPoints that people did for their project. I know for some of you this might be a little redundant because you did types of fishing, but maybe I have some things to say that you want to hear or something like that. And so I'm just going to go through each one of these slides and you'll see me, I'll be up in the top and I'll just narrate as we go. So this is just a fun political cartoon. You can look at it if you want, you don't really have to. But I did want to draw your attention to this infographic here. It says by the year 2050, the experts say that the fisheries industry is basically going to collapse. And the reason for that is because there is so much overfishing. And remember when we talked about tragedy of the commons, I'll talk about that in this video towards the end. 1/5 of the 50 billion fish that are caught every year, 1/5 of them are actually caught illegally, which is not good. There are some things that we can do to decrease the amount of fish that are caught illegally, which I'll talk about, called individual transferable quotas or ITQs. 90% of most of like tuna, swordfish, cod, halibut, things that you would normally eat. I know most of you have probably eaten tuna from a can before. It's actually pretty delicious. I love it. So let's talk about what is fishing. So fishing can be really divided into two categories, and it's basically where you catch fish, one for a commercial, like you're gonna sell it at a market, or if you want to be like a recreational fisher. So if you go out to Lake Hartwell or Lake Jocassee, and you're just fishing for fun, or you're fishing to buy your, or to, give your family some food or something, then you are probably a recreational fisher. So commercial fishing, you've probably seen, what is that show called? Deadliest Catch. You've probably seen that before. So commercial fishing is done around the world's oceans by large boats and companies. Recreational fishing is only going to be done by smaller individuals or smaller entities. So let's talk about, there are basically 4 different ways that commercial fishermen are going to catch fish. And the first way is called bottom trawling. And bottom trawling is, you've probably seen this in some movie before or something, where there's just this giant net and they drag the net along the bottom and they're trying to catch things that live in the sediment, like flounder, scallops, shrimp, things like that live in the sediment. And they're actually gonna, they'll take this giant crank and they'll try to reel in the net to see what they've caught. So one problem with this is that as it drags it along the bottom, it can get caught on things like coral reefs. And instead of them, stopping and saying, oh, this is bad, we probably shouldn't kill this coral reef, they just keep dragging it and it destroys all of the coral reef that's on the bottom. So one thing that we want to talk about is this word bycatch here. And bycatch is anything that you catch, but you don't really want it or you didn't mean to catch it. So what they do most of the time is they kill these things. So dolphins, sharks, sometimes they will catch some like seals, and instead of throwing them back or getting them untangled from the net, they'll just throw them, or they'll leave them there, they'll kill them and other things. Drift nets are actually this like giant nets that just kind of float out in the open ocean. And they float by buoys that are on the top of the nets, and they're extremely bad for dolphins, whales, sharks, anything that gets caught up in these drift nets. And one problem too with the drift nets is the fact that sometimes they'll set up the drift nets, they just kind of drift and float in the water, and then they forget where they put them, or they'll go back there to where they thought they put them and they're gone because of the waves or something. Some of the newer ones now, they have a GPS kind of thing on them, or they'll send you a signal whenever something is amiss or something. Abandoned nets can also catch fish. This is sometimes called ghost fishing. So again, when those fishermen forget where they put the nets, or they are just, the nets are just drifting, they can catch fish still. No one comes to collect the fish, and then those fish just wind up dying because they're trapped in the nets. So those are the first two, bottom trawling and drift net, or drift netting. And here are the last two. So longline, or pelagic longlining. If you see the word pelagic, that just means open ocean. So what you're going to do with pelagic longlining, or just longlining in general, is you have these giant stretches of hooks. And most of the time they're baited hooks with fish. I'm sure you've seen where they use this stuff called chum, where they just cut up all of the leftover fish and stuff like that. They, if you remember from SpongeBob, Plankton's restaurant is called the Chum Bucket, and chum is pretty disgusting. So what they do is they bait these hooks, and then they're hoping to catch tuna, swordfish, cod, but other things too will swim up to the hooks and try to, they'll be like, oh, that's interesting, let's see what it is. So they swim up to it and they try to see what it is, and then they get caught in the hooks. So one really bad thing about this one is that it can catch birds as well. So albatrosses are a type of bird, and they will swim up to the hook, and they'll say, oh, this looks nice, and they'll go clump, and then the hook goes through their bill, and they're then stuck there or trapped there. Sea turtles can also get hooked. Their shells get caught in the hooks, or maybe one of their fins, and then they're just kind of stuck there. And again, this whole thing about bycatch. You catch things that you don't want to, and then you just throw them back, or you just leave them there, and then they die. All right, the last one is called purse seine. And purse seine, the way that I remember this, it's kind of like a drawstring purse. So what you do is there's a giant net, and it's kind of got a drawstring around the top. And whenever like a giant like fish school swims into the net, you pull the drawstring, or you pull the string, and it basically closes the net, and then they're trapped. This one, it has less bycatch than other types of fishing, which is really good. So I would say this was probably the best one in terms of commercial fishing. All right, so let's talk about these. This first one here that I'm showing you, that I'm moving, this one is called purse seine. And so they have these, these drawstrings around here. There's a boat. The fish swim in, and then they close the net. All right, this one here is the pelagic longlining, or just longlining in general. So what they're doing is there's just miles and miles of these long lines that have hooks in them, and then all kinds of things swim up to them, and then they bite into the hooks. This one is called drift netting. Drift netting is where you just set up a giant net, and again, this one's really responsible for a lot of the ghost fishing. And then finally, this one here is bottom trawling, and bottom trawling is where you have a giant net off the back of a boat, and the boat has to be pretty big if it's going to pull in this much stuff. So remember in the movie Finding Nemo, when they say swim down, they're trying to break this type of net. All right, let's go on to talk about some other types of fishing techniques that are really destructive. So some of you may think, oh, people don't do these anymore, but they actually do. So here's some destructive fishing techniques, and the most common one I would say would be these first two. So blast or dynamite fishing, and then cyanide fishing. So the blast or dynamite fishing is where you've probably seen it in the movies before. They take a stick of dynamite or some TNT or some sort of homemade explosive. They throw it in, and then there's a giant explosion, and then they just catch all the fish, or they skim them off the top. Another thing that people have been doing is they have been taking the old like rotary crank phones, and they will crank them, and it sends out like an electromagnetic pulse into the water, and then it stuns the fish, and then they just rise to the top, and then people just skim them off. All right, this cyanide fishing, this one is really common in places like coral reefs. So a lot of times there are a ton of like tropical fish that they want to get in the coral reef. So what they'll do is they'll throw cyanide or sodium cyanide to stun the fish or to stun the coral reef. the coral reef will die and then the fish will swim out and then they'll collect the fish. This one is really interesting. It's called, and I'm going to butcher this, Muroami. And it's where they use these giant pounding devices that pounds coral reef and it breaks them apart. It scares the fish, it kills the coral reef, and then the fish have nowhere to live. Okay, so I've already talked about bycatch a little bit. So bycatch is the unwanted fish or other marine creatures that you catch, but you don't really want them. So what do you do with them? Most of the time they just kill them, which sounds really sad, but it's true. They don't want to untangle them from the net, or they don't want to take the time to deal with them. So a lot of times they'll shoot them, they will just leave them on the boats, so they basically asphyxiate because they're fish. It's really sad, and sometimes they'll just like cut the line and just leave the fish in there. So then it's like a giant massive net. If you remember the documentary we watched called Plastic Paradise, those giant things of nets, that's really responsible for this. So we've talked all year about this thing called Tragedy of the Commons. And the Tragedy of the Commons is where there is a resource that is not really owned by anyone. So the Earth's oceans are really common. You see what I did there? Really common commons. The atmosphere is another example of a really common commons. So in order to avoid overfishing the world's oceans, because if I see one person out there, they're catching tons of fish, I say I better get out there and catch a ton of fish too, because if I don't, then I'm going to lose out on some money. So I buy another boat, you buy another boat, and before long we've overfished the world's oceans. And so what they're doing now is they're instituting these things called individual fishing quotas, IFQs, or individual transferable quotas, or ITQs. So the United States, this is back in, I want to say this is the 70s. This is the Magnuson-Stevens Fishery Conservation and Management Act. And what this does is this allows for fishermen to have individual transferable quotas. So what they do is kind of like the cap and trade program. They give you a certain number of fish that you can catch, or a certain number of pounds, and stuff like that. And then if you don't use all of yours, then you can sell yours for the market price to another person who needs those, and then you can set whatever price you want. So remember, at the end of the year, if you have a ton left over, you can just store yours up and sell them to people for an inflated price. So this is another example of what they call free market environmentalism, where they establish a marketplace, they establish private property rights, and they're trying to generate a market, or a capitalistic market. All right, so what are some characteristics of a good ITQ system? So the first thing is you have to have some sort of cap, or the amount that they can catch at maximum. You also have to have some way to make sure that the sum of all the quotas is not going to go over what you think or what everyone thinks is the maximum allowable catch. So for example, if we add all of our catches up and it's over what we think the ocean can produce, then it's not a good ITQ system. And then the last one is that the quotas can be bought or sold on an open market for a going market price. And when I say a going market price, if you wait until the end of the year and you store up your quotas, you could sell them for an inflated price. It just depends on how desperate people are. All right. So let's go on to the next one. So here are some problems with this, and these are the things that people always bring up when they're talking about why we shouldn't do these ITQs or IFQs. So one problem with this is that the enforcement. So what are we going to do if people are just downright lying and they're catching, so much more than they're reporting? So what they've done to remedy that, or to get rid of that, is they have basically had a wildlife biologist on every boat to measure the catch and keep people honest. But those people can be bribed, right? So that one's kind of some people say that the ITQs or the IFQs, they are pushing out smaller people, like smaller businesses. So if you want to get into the marketplace, then the ITQs are allotted by who has the most boats, the most basically most capital, or the most money. So if you're new to the market, like you're new and you have no idea what you're doing, then you're going to have to buy those ITQs from others who are already in the market, and most of the time people don't want to sell them to you. There are also no quotas for bycatch, so you can just really catch anything you want. If it's not something that you want to keep, you just throw it back or you kill it, and that is, there's no quota for that. All right, so this is a really good video if you're interested in learning about these individual transferable quotas. And then finally, here's some laws that are associated with fishing. The first one, and I've highlighted the ones in blue that are international laws or international agreements, and the ones in red are just ones that are in America. So the United Nations Laws of the Seas, this is where they have established the kind of like private property rights for each country. So individual countries have basically economic rights that extend 200 miles off their shores. And it also allows for transferable quotas in the fishing industry. This next one I'm going to be talking about a lot in a later video about environmental laws. It's called the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Flora and Fauna, and most of the time it is abbreviated CITES, C-I-T-E-S. If you abbreviate this on the AP exam, they'll know what you mean. So this one is a whole international agreement, and it's ensuring that the trade of wild animals, plants, it doesn't threaten their survival. So if the fishery industry does fall underneath this, we're trying not to deplete the world's oceans. The last two, the Marine Mammal Protection Act, if you are going to, let's say that we want to stop someone from killing so many dolphins or killing so many whales, we could use this act to decrease the amount of bycatch. So if we know that a company is killing a ton of dolphins and whales, we can invoke this act to have them investigated, because you're not allowed to kill marine mammals. And then the last one, this Lacey Act of 1900, this is going to prohibit the sale of illegally harvested species. So let's say that I have an allotment that I'm supposed to catch. It's a number of pounds of a certain type of fish, and I go over that and I'm going to sell them illegally. I would be then breaking this law. So this act is actually intended back in Teddy Roosevelt's day, when everyone was hunting down animals and then collecting their pelts and all kinds of stuff, and then they were selling them when they actually shouldn't have been, because it was an illegally harvested species. So I hope you've enjoyed this video about tragedy of the commons with fisheries, the different types of fishing methods. If you're interested in free market environmentalism, I would say look into this video here. This guy, I believe he teaches natural resource economics, and that's actually a pretty big career field if you would like to go into something like that. You can also be an environmental lawyer and deal with this type of stuff. You can also, if you're more interested in being on a boat, being like the Deadliest Catch people, you could be a wildlife biologist on a ship, making sure that people are complying with these ITQs or IFQs. If you have any questions, please let me know. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. Have a great day.